If this video showed up for you, it's because this story is going to move you and give you chills. So go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of story, and comment which city you're watching from. The sky over the city of Seattle was a bruised shade of purple and gray, weeping a relentless, freezing rain that seemed to soak right through the black umbrellas gathered at the cemetery. The air smelled of wet earth, crushed pine needles, and the overwhelming sickly sweet scent of white lilies. It was a cold day, but the chill that Officer Thomas felt had nothing to do with the weather. It was the hollow, aching cold of losing a brother. He stood rigid in his dress uniform, the brass buttons cold against his chest, staring at the polished mahogany casket. Inside lay Officer Jake Harrison, a hero, a father figure to the rookies, and Thomas's best friend. The silence in the cemetery was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of rain on fabric and the occasional stifled sob from the front row. But there was one sound that cut through the gloom sharper than any knife. It was the sound of a chain rattling against a leather collar. Sitting beside the grave, drenched and shivering, was Max, the massive German shepherd, Jake's canine partner for 6 years, sat with a posture that looked less like discipline and more like devastation. His ears were pinned back, his amber eyes fixed unblinkingly on the wooden box that held his handler. Thomas watched the dog's chest heave. They say dogs don't understand death, that they only wait for their master to return. But looking at Max, Thomas wasn't so sure. The dog looked like he knew exactly what was happening, and the pain in his eyes was almost too human to bear. But Thomas knew something else about that dog. Max wasn't just a pet. He was a highly trained instrument of justice. And usually, when Max went quiet, it meant he was watching something dangerous. Thomas shifted his gaze to Sarah, Jake's widow. She sat in the front row, clutching a folded American flag to her chest, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and vacant. She looked small, swallowed by the grief in the oversized black coat she wore. Thomas wanted to step forward, to offer a hand, a word, anything to break the bubble of isolation around her. But he couldn't. The ceremony was strictly regimented, a final salute to a man who lived by the code. However, protocols were about to be broken in a way no one could have predicted. As the priest stepped forward, clearing his throat to begin the eulogy, the atmosphere shifted. The wind picked up, rustling the wreaths, and Max's head suddenly snapped up. The low, mournful posture vanished. His ears pricked forward, swiveling like radar dishes. The quiet whimper that had been escaping his throat stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, rumbling vibration in his chest. Thomas felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He had spent hundreds of hours on patrol with Jake and Max. He knew every sound that dog made. He knew the playful bark for a tennis ball, the terrifying roar for a suspect fleeing, and the low growl of a threat detection. What Max was doing now, it wasn't grief, it was focus. The priest began to speak, his voice droning on about peace and the afterlife, but Max wasn't listening. The dog stood up, the leash pulling taut in the handler's grip. The young officer holding Max, a rookie named Miller, looked nervous. He tugged gently on the leash. "Sit, Max. Easy boy," he whispered, trying to keep his voice down so as not to disrupt the solemnity of the moment. But Max ignored him. The dog took a step toward the grave, his nose twitching violently, inhaling the scent of the rain in the wood. And then he let out a sound that made half the attendees jump. Not a howl, not a cry. It was a sharp, demanding bark. Woof! Woof! He lunged against the leash, his claws digging into the mud, dragging the surprised rookie forward a few inches. The priest paused, looking uncertainly at the funeral director. The director, a stern man in a flawless suit, gestured frantically for the officer to remove the dog. "Get him out of here! It's disrespectful!"
Miller struggled, wrapping the leash around his hand, pulling back with all his weight. "Come on, Max, let's go," he hissed. But Max was 90 pounds of pure muscle and determination. He planted his feet and refused to move. Then, he did something that stopped Thomas's heart for a second. Max didn't just look at the coffin. He looked at the seam of the lid, and he began to whine, a high-pitched, frantic sound that Thomas had only heard once before. It was the sound Max made when he found a survivor trapped under rubble during a building collapse 3 years ago. It was the sound of life detection. "Something is wrong," Thomas muttered to himself, stepping out of the formation. The rain lashed harder against his face, blurring his vision, but he couldn't look away from the dog. Max was now frantic, spinning in a circle at the end of the leash, barking a rhythmic, urgent cadence. Bark, bark, pause, bark, bark. It wasn't a goodbye, it was a signal. The crowd was getting restless. Sarah looked up, her eyes wide with confusion and fresh pain. Seeing the dog so distressed was tearing her apart. She looked at Thomas, a silent plea in her eyes to make it stop, to let Jake rest in peace. But Thomas couldn't move to silence the dog. His feet were carrying him toward the grave, driven by a gut feeling that ignored all logic. Max broke free. With a surge of power, the dog yanked the leash from Miller's slick, wet hands. The leather strap whipped through the air. Screams erupted from the mourners as the German shepherd bolted, not away from the grave, but directly onto it. Max leapt, his paws landing with a heavy thud on the polished wood of the casket. The funeral director gasped aloud, "Stop that dog! Someone stop him!" But no one dared to approach. Max wasn't attacking. He was frantically scratching at the wood, his claws leaving deep, pale gouges in the expensive finish. He was digging. He was trying to get in. He was barking directly at the wood, his nose pressed against the seam, desperate to reach whatever was inside. "He's gone mad with grief," someone shouted. "Get him off!" 2 officers stepped forward to grab the dog, but Thomas intercepted them. He raised his hand, his voice booming over the sound of the rain and the dog's frantic scratching. "Wait!" Thomas shouted. "Nobody touch him!" The funeral director, face red with indignation, stormed over to Thomas. "Officer, this is a desecration. That animal is destroying the casket. Control your unit." Thomas ignored the man. He walked slowly toward the casket, the mud squelching under his boots. He looked at Max. The dog stopped scratching for a second, looked Thomas dead in the eye, and let out a single sharp bark, then looked back at the lid. The message was clear. It was precise. "He's alerting," Thomas said, his voice trembling slightly. "He's alerting to something inside the coffin."
"He's alerting?" the funeral director sputtered, wiping rain from his forehead, his face twisting into a mask of disbelief and anger. "Officer, with all due respect, the man inside is dead. Of course the dog smells something. He smells death. Now step aside so we can finish this ceremony with dignity." The crowd murmured in agreement. To them, this was a breakdown, a tragic, embarrassing collapse of order. Even Sarah stood up, her voice trembling as she called out, "Thomas, please, don't let them do this. Just let Jake go." Her voice cracked on the last word, a sound so full of pain it almost made Thomas step back. Almost. But Max hadn't moved. The dog was trembling now, his nose pressed so hard against the wood that his breath was fogging the polished surface. He looked back at Thomas and gave a low, urgent woof. It was a specific sound. It was the sound Max used when he found a child lost in the woods 2 winters ago. It wasn't a sound of loss. It was a sound of discovery. "I can't do that, Sarah," Thomas said softly, though his voice carried in the sudden silence of the cemetery. He turned to the director, his expression hardening into stone. "Open it." "Absolutely not," the director snapped, stepping in front of the casket to block the way. "This is a violation of state law, moral decency, and—" "I said open the damn casket," Thomas roared, his hand instinctively dropping to his belt, though not to his weapon.
The authority in his voice was absolute. It was the voice of a man who had commanded crime scenes and chaotic riots. If this dog says there is something in there that shouldn't be, I believe him. Now you can open it, or I will pry it open with a crowbar myself. The threat hung heavy in the freezing air. The rain seemed to intensify, drumming a frantic rhythm against the umbrellas. The director looked at Thomas, then at the growling dog, and finally at the stoic faces of the other officers who had stepped up behind Thomas, forming a silent wall of blue. They trusted Thomas, and they trusted Max. With a disgusted huff, the director signaled to his assistants. "Fine, but on your head be it. You're traumatizing the widow for a dog's delusion." The assistants stepped forward, their movements stiff and reluctant. The sound of the latch unhooking was deafeningly loud, a metallic clack that echoed like a gunshot. Max stopped barking instantly. His tail gave a single, tentative wag. Thomas held his breath. Sarah covered her mouth with both hands, unable to look away. Slowly, agonizingly, the heavy mahogany lid was lifted. Instantly, rain began to spot the pristine white silk of the interior. There lay Jake, his face pale and waxy, his uniform pressed to perfection, his hands clasped over his chest. For a second, there was nothing, just the stillness of death. The director opened his mouth to say, "I told you so," to condemn Thomas for this desecration. But then, the uniform moved. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the funeral gathering. It wasn't Jake. Jake was gone. But right there, nestled in the crook of Jake's cold arm, tucked deep inside the open breast of his dress jacket, something wriggled. A tiny, high-pitched squeak pierced the silence. It was a sound so small, yet it hit the crowd with the force of a bomb. Max let out a soft whine and stood on his hind legs, resting his front paws gently on the edge of the open casket, licking the air frantically. The puppy let out a tiny yelp, and Max responded with a soft, rumbling purr that vibrated through Thomas's hand. "Sarah," Thomas called out, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah was already there. She had rushed forward the moment she saw the movement. She stared at the puppy in Thomas's hand as if it were a ghost. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably as she reached out. "Is that—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "There's a note," Thomas said, unpinning the paper. He handed the puppy to Sarah, who cradled it against her chest, shielding it from the rain with her coat. The tiny creature instantly burrowed into her warmth. Thomas unfolded the paper. The handwriting was shaky, scrawled in haste, perhaps in pain. It was Jake's handwriting. The rain threatened to blur the ink, so Thomas tilted his umbrella to shield it, reading the words aloud to the stunned silence of the cemetery. "If you're reading this, then I didn't make it home. But they have to make it. Found her in the raid. Mother was dead. She was the only one left. Couldn't leave her. Couldn't process her into the system. They'd put her down. Hide her, please. Max knows. Max will help. Protect them both. Love. Jake." Thomas lowered the note, his throat tightening so hard it hurt to swallow. The reality of what had happened hit him like a physical blow. The raid, the drug bust 3 days ago where Jake had been shot. He hadn't just secured the perimeter. He had found something else in that chaos, a life that nobody else noticed. Even while bleeding out, even while the paramedics were loading him up, Jake must have hidden the puppy. But how it got into the casket, that was a mystery that died with him. Or perhaps, Thomas thought, glancing at the mortuary assistant who was looking down at his shoes with tears in his eyes, Jake had an accomplice, someone who honored a dying wish over protocol. Sarah was weeping now, but it wasn't the desolate, hollow weeping of before. She buried her face in the puppy's fur, rocking back and forth. Max pressed his large head against her leg, his tail thumping a slow, steady rhythm against the wet grass. The frantic alert was gone. He was on guard duty now. He wasn't barking at the coffin, Thomas realized, speaking more to himself than anyone else. He was barking at the puppy. He could hear its heartbeat. The tension in the cemetery broke. The anger, the shock, the judgment, it all dissolved into a profound, aching tenderness. The funeral director, previously so indignant, took off his hat and bowed his head, shame coloring his cheeks. But as touching as the moment was, the world doesn't stop for miracles, and neither does the law. As the service hurriedly concluded, the puppy now safely tucked inside Sarah's coat, Thomas noticed a car parked at the far edge of the cemetery. It wasn't a police cruiser. It was a black sedan with tinted windows, and standing beside it was a man Thomas recognized instantly. Detective Miller from Internal Affairs. Miller wasn't mourning. He was watching, and he was on his phone, staring directly at the puppy in Sarah's arms. Thomas felt a cold pit form in his stomach, colder than the rain. Jake's note said, couldn't process her into the system. They'd put her down. That wasn't just standard procedure. In the city, canine units were strictly regulated. Unauthorized animals from crime scenes were considered evidence or contraband. If that puppy was part of a bust involving a dog-fighting ring or illegal breeding, she was technically evidence to be destroyed or impounded. And Jake, by hiding her, had tampered with a crime scene. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah walked toward Thomas, her eyes finally possessing a spark of life. "Thomas," she whispered, stroking the puppy's head. "He saved her. Even at the end, he was saving someone." "He did," Thomas said, forcing a smile, but his eyes were locked on the black sedan. The detective was walking toward them now, stepping over the graves with a purposeful stride. "Sarah, you need to go, now." "What?" She blinked, confused. "Why?" "The receptionist—" "Skip the reception," Thomas said, his voice low and urgent. He placed a hand on the small of her back, guiding her toward her car. "Take Max. Take the puppy. Go home and lock the door. Don't answer it for anyone but me." "Thomas, you're scaring me. What's going on?" "The note," Thomas hissed. "Jake admitted to taking evidence from a crime scene. That puppy, technically, she doesn't belong to us, and there are people who stick to the rules even when it's cruel." Before Sarah could respond, Detective Miller blocked their path. He was a dry, colorless man who looked like he hadn't smiled in a decade. He looked at Sarah, then at the lump in her coat. "Mrs. Harrison," Miller said, his voice flat, "my condolences, truly." He held out a hand, palm up. "But I'm going to need to take possession of the animal." Max let out a low, vibrating growl, stepping between Sarah and the detective. "It's a puppy, Miller," Thomas said, stepping in as well, his chest brushing against the detective's suit. "She's 3 weeks old. She's not evidence. She's a pet. She was removed from a federal crime scene involving a narcotics ring. She's potential biological evidence. And the note, that's a confession of misconduct. I need the dog and I need that note." Sarah clutched the puppy tighter, stepping back. "You're not taking her. This is all I have left of him." "I'm sorry, ma'am. It's not a request." Miller reached for his radio. "Don't make this a scene at your husband's funeral." Thomas saw the look in Sarah's eyes. It was the look of a cornered animal. If Miller tried to take that puppy, Sarah would break, and Max would tear Miller's throat out. The situation was spiraling from a funeral to a standoff in seconds. Thomas made a split-second decision, a decision that could cost him his badge, his pension, and his freedom.
"Arrest me then." Thomas stepped closer, invading Miller's personal space. The rain dripped from the brim of his hat onto the detective's expensive shoes. He lowered his voice to a growl that matched Max. "You want to arrest a uniformed officer at a hero's funeral in front of the press. Look around, Miller." Thomas gestured subtly with his head. Beyond the cemetery gates, news vans were packing up, but cameras were still rolling. A confrontation here would be a PR nightmare that the department would never recover from. Miller's eyes darted to the cameras, then back to Thomas, his jaw tightening until a vein pulsed in his temple. He knew he was checkmated. For now. "Go, Sarah," Thomas commanded, not taking his eyes off the detective. "Get in the car." Sarah didn't hesitate. She scrambled into the driver's seat of her old sedan, the puppy tucked inside her coat like a smuggled heart. Max didn't need an order. He vaulted into the back seat, positioning himself instantly at the rear window, staring down Miller with eyes that promised violence if the man took one step closer. The engine roared to life, a desperate, sputtering sound that echoed the frantic beating of Sarah's heart. "This isn't over, Thomas," Miller hissed as the car peeled away, tires spinning on the wet asphalt. "You just aided in the theft of evidence. I'll have your badge on my desk by morning." "Do what you have to do," Thomas replied, watching Sarah's taillights fade into the mist. He felt a strange lightness in his chest despite the threat. He had lost his best friend, but he had saved the last promise Jake ever made. But as he stood there in the rain, Thomas knew the reprieve was temporary. Men like Miller didn't lose. They just regrouped. The weeks that followed were a blur of grief and quiet healing inside Sarah's small house. She named the puppy Bella, meaning beautiful, but also war. It fit. The little ball of fur was a fighter. She had survived a raid, a cold night in a casket, and the threat of the law. And now, she was surviving the sadness that filled the house. Max took over where Jake had left off. It was mesmerizing to watch. The massive, battle-hardened K9 who could take down a fleeing felon in seconds became the gentlest nursemaid. When Bella whimpered in her sleep, dreaming of the cold, Max was there, curling his giant body around her, acting as a living shield against the world. He taught her. He nudged her away from the stairs. He barked softly when she chewed on the furniture, a disciplinary sound. Firm, but kind. He was raising her. And in raising her, he was saving Sarah. One evening, Thomas came by to check on them. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he wasn't wearing his uniform. Miller had made good on his threat. Thomas was on administrative leave pending an investigation. He sat at the kitchen table, watching Bella clumsily try to tackle Max's tail. Max tolerated it with the patience of a saint, occasionally glancing at Jake's empty chair with a look that broke Thomas's heart. "They're building a case, Sarah," Thomas said quietly, swirling the coffee in his mug. "Miller dug up the report from the raid. He's claiming Jake was compromised, that he stole drugs along with the dog. He's trying to ruin Jake's name to justify seizing the assets." Sarah slammed her hand on the table. "That's a lie. Jake was the most honest man on the force." "I know that. You know that. But Miller doesn't care about the truth. He cares about closing the loop. He says a civilian, that's you, is in possession of dangerous contraband. He's going to come for her, Sarah, with a warrant." The air in the kitchen grew heavy. Bella, sensing the tension, stopped playing and scampered over to Sarah, hiding behind her legs. Max stood up, a low growl rumbling in his throat as he looked at the front door. "Let them come," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling but fierce. "I've lost my husband. I will not lose the life he saved." But bravery doesn't stop a court order. 3 days later, the nightmare arrived. It wasn't a knock. It was a pounding that shook the frame of the door. Sarah froze in the hallway. It was 6 a.m. Outside, the flashing lights of police cruisers cut through the morning fog, painting the living room in chaotic bursts of red and blue. It looked like a raid. "Police, open up!" Max went berserk. He launched himself at the door, barking with a ferocity that shook the windows. This wasn't the bark of a pet. It was the roar of a protector facing an invasion. Bella scurried under the sofa, whining in terror. Sarah ran to the door, her hands shaking so hard she could barely undo the chain. "Stop! I'm opening it. Please,
Don't hurt the dogs." She threw the door open. Standing on her porch wasn't just Miller. It was animal control. Behind them stood two uniformed officers who looked ashamed to be there, refusing to meet Sarah's eyes. Miller held up a piece of paper, stamped and signed. "Sarah Harrison, by order of the court, we are here to seize the canine known as Unidentified Asset 4 for forensic testing and quarantine. Step aside." "She has a name," Sarah screamed, blocking the doorway with her body. "Her name is Bella, and she's not evidence." "Get the dog," Miller ordered, the animal control officers.
They stepped forward, carrying catch poles, long sticks with wire loops at the end. The sight of them triggered something primal in Max. He wasn't just a dog protecting a home. He was a canine officer seeing a weapon. Max lunged. He didn't bite, but he hit the first officer in the chest with 90 pounds of force, knocking the man backward off the porch. The officer tumbled into the bushes, the catch pole clattering to the driveway. "Max, no!" Sarah screamed. "Officer down," Miller shouted, his hand going to his holster. "Control the animal or we will neutralize it." Time seemed to slow down. Max stood on the top step, teeth bared, a wall of fur and fury between the men and the puppy inside. He was doing exactly what he was trained to do, protect the VIP. But this time, the bad guys were wearing badges. If Max attacked again, they would shoot him. Sarah knew it. Thomas, who had just pulled up to the curb in his personal truck, knew it too. He leaped out of his vehicle, sprinting across the lawn. "Don't shoot!" Thomas screamed. "Max, aus! Stand down!" The command, spoken in the German used for police training, cut through the red haze in Max's mind. The dog froze, his muscles quivering with the effort to restrain himself. He looked at Thomas, then at Sarah, confused. Why were they stopping him? These men were the threat. Miller smirked, reholstering his weapon. "Aggressive behavior, that's another citation. Grab the puppy, now." While Max was held at bay by Thomas's commands, the second animal control officer slipped past Sarah. He reached under the sofa. There was a high-pitched yelp, a sound of pure terror as the wire loop tightened around Bella's neck. "No!" Sarah lunged, grabbing the officer's arm. "You're hurting her." "Ma'am, do not touch the officer," Miller warned, stepping closer. They dragged Bella out. She was thrashing, peeing on the floor in fear, her eyes wide and rolling. Max let out a sound that was less like a bark and more like a human scream of frustration. He lunged against Thomas's grip on his collar, his claws gouging the floorboards. They carried Bella out to the van, tossing her into a metal cage like she was garbage. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed in Sarah's soul. "We'll be in touch regarding the older dog's fate," Miller said coldly, adjusting his tie. "Assaulting an officer is grounds for euthanasia. I'd suggest you say your goodbyes." As the convoy of cars pulled away, leaving Sarah sobbing on her knees in the driveway, silence returned to the street. But it wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a crater after the bomb has gone off. Thomas stood on the porch, holding Max's collar. The dog wasn't barking anymore. He was staring at the retreating van, his body rigid. He wasn't sad. He was calculating. Thomas looked down at the dog, and he saw it. The same look Jake used to get when a case went cold, but he knew who the killer was. "I know, buddy," Thomas whispered, his voice dark and dangerous. "They took her." Max looked up at Thomas, and for the first time, he didn't look for a command. He nudged Thomas's hand, then walked to the car door of Thomas's truck and waited. He didn't want to go inside the house. He wanted to go hunting. Thomas looked at Sarah, who was broken, defeated on the concrete. Then he looked at the dog. He realized that following the rules had failed. Being the good cop had failed. Jake hadn't followed the rules to save Bella. Maybe it was time Thomas stopped following them too. "Sarah," Thomas said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Get up." She looked up, tear-streaked and hopeless. "They took her, Thomas. They're going to kill her." "Not if we get to her first," Thomas said, walking over to help her stand. He looked toward the station, a plan forming in his mind, a reckless, stupid, career-ending plan. "I know where the impound lot is, and I know the security codes." You're going to break her out?" Sarah asked, hope warring with fear in her eyes. "No,"
Thomas said, opening the truck door for Max, who leapt in instantly. "We're not just breaking her out, we're exposing Miller. But to do that, I need to know exactly what Jake found on that raid. We need to find the rest of the note." Sarah froze. The rest of the note? Jake never wrote one page. He always used a carbon copy notebook. If the original page is gone, the imprint is still in his locker, and I have the key. The climax was coming, but they had no idea that Miller wasn't just a bureaucrat. He was covering up something far bigger than a stray dog, and tonight, the hunter would become the hunted.
The precinct was a fortress of brick and glass, usually buzzing with the chaotic energy of the night shift, but at 3 a.m., it was in a lull, the quiet hour before the bars closed and the drunks started rolling in. Thomas parked his truck 2 blocks away, in the shadow of an abandoned warehouse. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and black, reflecting the neon signs of the city like spilled oil. "Stay here," Thomas told Sarah. "Keep the engine running. If I'm not back in 20 minutes, leave. Go to your sister's in Oregon. Don't look back." "Thomas," Sarah reached out, grabbing his wrist. Her fingers were cold. "Why are you doing this? You could lose everything." Thomas looked in the rearview mirror. Max was sitting in the back, silent, his eyes fixed on the distant police station. The dog let out a soft whine, sensing the mission. "Because Jake would have done it for me," Thomas said simply. He patted Max's head. "Watch your boy." Max gave a low woof of acknowledgement. Thomas slipped out into the night. He wasn't wearing his uniform, but he moved like he owned the streets. He knew the shift rotation. He knew the back entrance code hadn't been changed in 6 months because the budget for IT upgrades had been slashed. He punched in the code, 4912. The heavy steel door clicked open. The hallway smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. Thomas moved silently, avoiding the main bullpen. He slipped into the locker room, the rows of metal cabinets standing like silent sentinels. He found Jake's locker. It still had his name taped to it, Officer Harrison. Someone had taped a small paper flower to the metal. Thomas's hand shook as he inserted the key he'd kept since the funeral, a copy Jake had given him years ago for emergencies. The lock tumbled. Inside, Jake's personal effects were still there. His spare boots, a picture of Sarah, and on the top shelf, his black Write in the Rain notebook. Thomas grabbed it, flipping to the last used page. The page itself was torn out, the note found in the coffin. But Thomas angled the notebook under the harsh fluorescent light. The faint indentations of the pen were there on the next page. He grabbed a pencil from a nearby bench and lightly shaded over the blank page. The words began to appear, white against the graphite gray. It wasn't just a goodbye letter. It was a list. Loc, 4500 block, Indy District. Warehouse 4. Drugs, fentanyl, 50 kilos. Miller on scene before raid. Saw him talking to target. Puppy as leverage. Breeding stock for fighting ring. Miller's side hustle. If I go down, Miller did it. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. The air in the locker room suddenly felt thin. This wasn't just about a dog. Jake hadn't been killed by a random dealer. He had been set up. Miller wasn't just internal affairs. He was on the payroll. The puppy wasn't just evidence. She was proof of Miller's connection to the dog fighting ring he was supposed to be investigating. "Found something interesting, Thomas?" The voice came from the doorway. Thomas spun around. Detective Miller stood there leaning casually against the frame, but the casualness was a lie. In his right hand, he held a silenced pistol, leveled directly at Thomas's chest. "I knew you'd come back for the notebook." Jake was sentimental. He wrote everything down. "And you're just predictable." "You killed him," Thomas said, his voice low. He didn't raise his hands. He gauged the distance. 20 feet. Too far to rush him. "I didn't pull the trigger," Miller shrugged. "I just, delayed the backup. Let nature take its course." Jake was a good cop, but he was nosy. He found the warehouse, he found the breeding operation, and worst of all, he found that mutt. Miller gestured with the gun. "Give me the notebook. Then maybe you walk out of here. Disgraced, sure, but alive." Thomas looked at the notebook, then at Miller. He knew Miller was lying. There was no walking out of here. Miller couldn't leave loose ends. You want it? He held up the notebook. Come and get it. Miller sighed. Have it your way. He took a step forward, raising the gun to fire. Crash! The high window of the locker room shattered inward amidst a shower of glass shards. Miller flinched, turning his head for a fraction of a second. That was all Max needed. The German Shepherd hit the floor, scrambled for traction on the tiles, and launched himself at Miller like a heat-seeking missile. Miller fired wildly. Thwip, thwip. 2 bullets hit the lockers, sparking against the metal. Max's jaws clamped onto Miller's gun arm with a sickening crunch.
Ah!
Miller screamed, the gun clattering to the floor. Max didn't let go. He shook his head violently, dragging the detective to the ground. Miller punched the dog, kicking him, screaming in agony. But Max was a machine of vengeance. He was fighting for Jake. He was fighting for Bella.
Thomas didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, kicking the gun away under the lockers. He grabbed his handcuffs from his back pocket, the ones he technically shouldn't be carrying, and pinned Miller's other arm. "Max! Ouse!" Thomas shouted. Max released the arm instantly, but stood over Miller, snarling, his muzzle inches from the detective's throat. Drool and blood dripped from his jaws. "You have the right to remain silent," Thomas panted, snapping the cuffs on Miller. "But I really hope you don't." The door to the locker room burst open. 3 uniformed officers rushed in, guns drawn. They saw Thomas, the shattered window, the bleeding detective, and the growling dog. "Drop it," one shouted. "It's over," Thomas yelled, holding up the notebook. "It's all in here. Miller set up Harrison. Check the ballistics. Check his phone records. It's all here." The officers hesitated. They looked at Miller, groaning on the floor, and then at Thomas, their brother in blue. "Secure him," the sergeant ordered, pointing at Miller. The sun was rising over the city, bathing the wet streets in a golden glow. It was a new day. The Animal Control Center was much quieter than the precinct. When Thomas walked in, flanked by the chief of police and a very smug-looking Max, the clerk didn't ask for paperwork. The news was already out. Miller was in custody. The ring had been busted. Thomas walked down the row of cages. The smell of bleach and sadness was overwhelming. But then he heard it. A tiny, familiar squeak. In cage 4, curled in the corner, was Bella. She looked terrified, shivering on the cold concrete. Max let out a sharp bark. Bella's head popped up. She scrambled to the bars, her tail wagging so hard her whole body wiggled. Thomas opened the cage. He didn't have to pick her up this time. She ran out, tripping over her own paws, and threw herself at Max. The big dog lowered his head, nudging her, checking her over, licking her face. It was a reunion of pure, unadulterated joy. Thomas picked her up, tucking her under his arm. "Let's go home." 6 months later, the grass in the park was green and lush. Sarah sat on a bench, laughing as a clumsy, half-grown German Shepherd tripped over a soccer ball. Bella was getting big. Her ears were finally standing up, though one was still a bit floppy. Max lay at Sarah's feet, chewing on a thick stick. He looked older now. The gray around his muzzle had spread. He moved a little slower, but his eyes were bright. He was retired now, officially adopted by Sarah. Thomas walked up, holding 2 coffees. He sat down next to Sarah. "She's getting fast," Thomas noted, watching Bella chase a butterfly. "She reminds me of him," Sarah said softly. "She's stubborn." "She's a survivor," Thomas corrected. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the dogs. The pain of Jake's loss was still there. It would always be there, like a scar that aches when it rains. But it wasn't a gaping wound anymore. It was a part of them. Max suddenly looked up. He stared at a space in the trees, his ears pricked. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just wagged his tail, a slow, gentle thump against the grass. Sarah followed his gaze. "What is it, Max?" There was nothing there, just the wind in the leaves and the sunlight filtering through the branches. "I think he's checking in," Thomas said, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Sarah smiled, tears glistening in her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. "Yeah, I think so too." Bella ran back to them, dropping the slobbery ball at Thomas's feet. She looked at him, then at Max, and let out a demanding bark. "Play with me!" Thomas laughed, picking up the ball. He threw it as hard as he could. "Go get it!" As the two dogs raced across the field, the old warrior and the young apprentice, Thomas realized something. The funeral hadn't been an end. It was just a terrifying, painful, necessary middle. Jake hadn't just saved a puppy that day in the raid. By putting her in that casket, by trusting Max to find her, he had given Sarah a reason to get up in the morning. He had given Thomas a reason to fight the corruption. He had saved them all. Sometimes, the ones we lose never really leave us. They just change the way they look out for us. Sometimes they come back in the wag of a tail, the warmth of a fur coat, or the courage to stand up when everything seems lost. If this story moved you, if you felt the chill of the rain and the warmth of the reunion, leave a comment below with the name of your first pet. And don't forget to share this video, because somewhere out there, someone needs to know that even in the darkest moments, love always finds a way to bark its way back into the light.